in the United States, where I'm more familiar with, especially like New York, where there's a lot of activism for like a lot of different things. I think that activism works as a source for people to want to be involved into something that they can't directly be involved in, if that makes sense. So they can't push legislation. They're not senators or anything like that to influence what is happening in Israel, Palestine, wherever around the world they want to influence. So protesting and activism works as a sort of supplement to try to get people that live in diaspora involved in, I guess, preserving culture and getting more, I guess, uh, more connected with everyone, with the community around them, as well as the community in the country that they're trying to connect to. In our case, Palestinian activism or Israeli activism. Um, yeah, so that I'll start off with there. If Rudy wants to say anything.
Yeah, so by the way, Adar, you called me Israel, which isn't so incorrect because my Hebrew name is Israel. So
Wait,
you weren't all the
I
way wrong there, but
I called you Israel?
Yeah.
yeah, you're like Israel and Mo, which to be honest, it's not really a mistake because my Hebrew name is Israel, so that's also my name. But
I
first of
felt
all,
it
I
in
want
my
to
heart.
thank I want to thank Mohammed and Adal for being here, for speaking, for communicating, for us both to share our hearts and our passions, and hopefully to find from each other and to be able to be part of the next generation that builds something together. In terms of activism, I tend to define it as very different than the word advocacy. And in the Jewish world, at least, this word advocacy is often used, Israel advocacy, Jewish advocacy. And for me, the relationship I have with it being an advocate is sort of being a supporter of something. So if you think of, like, let's say a sports game, it's like a cheerleader, someone, or a fan, someone who supports something. For me, activism is more of a player on the ground, someone that wants to use their abilities, their talents, their resources, their contacts, their situation to try to change something for the better of what they see wrong in the world. So someone who's actually a player on the ground. That's how I define activism. For me, I kind of became an activist specifically on college campuses. Had
You're getting a little choppy on my end. Mo, do you hear him clearly?
It's pretty choppy on my end too.
Rudy, you seem to be stuck.
you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Yep, you're back.
Can you hear me now?
Yep. Yep, we're
There's a
good.
little bit of a delay, so I hope that it'll be fine. But if it gets choppy again, just let me know. So in terms of activism, I got involved with activism around 2013 when I started at UCLA and Santa Monica College before transferring to Columbia, and I realized that the arena of ideas or the campus was very divisive. It's either you had to pick you were pro-Palestinian or you were pro-Israel, and if you were pro-Palestinian, it meant you had to be against Israel and Israelis, and if you were pro-Israel, you had to be against Palestinian and against the idea that Palestinians can exist here too, or against the ideas that they have an identity or that they're real human beings. And there was immediately this polarization, and then everyone else around sort of played into it, meaning they would support one side or the other, and making us feel like it was really a zero-sum game that you had to choose. I automatically, out of defense, took the side of Israel, started to defend our identity, our history, our aspirations, our culture, our relationship with the land, everything that people that I felt in my experience were attacking us, our side. But at some point, I realized that, the other side isn't actually my enemy. And in fact, that there's no future in the land where Israelis or Palestinians disappear, which is something I say often. So why, instead of like having all these different groups supporting this group or that group, why isn't the Palestinian and the Israeli activist group actually having sit down meetings, conversations, figuring out what is wrong with the region, what do we actually agree on, sharing some visions of what we want to build? And that's kind of the topic that I want to really focus on, because with the years of doing what I'm doing and obviously evolving as a human being and working in the land of Israel, bringing Israelis and Palestinians together, I noticed something particularly strange on my trip to France right now, where I went to a university called Nanterre, which is predominantly known for being not only very anti-Israel, but anti-specifically Jewish. In fact, we came there and they told Jews, get out of here. We don't want any Jews here. Jews shouldn't even be in France. Things like that is what we were hearing. So that's not even related to the Israel and Palestinian conflict. And then they were saying, well, anyways, we're on the side of Palestine and we want this and we want that. And we're with the Palestinians. We're against you. And I had a conversation. I was like, well, I'm not against this, and I'm against the wall, and I want local representation for Palestinians, and I'm not against the idea of the right of return. And he started saying, well, what do you mean the right of return? I was like, well, haven't you heard that for Palestinians, a central part of what's important for them is having the right for Palestinians to return to the land, regardless of what I believe or not. That's a central part of what most Palestinian activists believe. And he's like, no, they don't care about that. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, no, it's only about the Palestinians living there. The ones that are out, we don't care about them. And I realized that everyone standing in front of me screaming on behalf for Palestinians, not one of them was Palestinian. And they were sort of using the struggle and narrative of the Palestinians and using that to be anti-Israel. And my understanding of this situation is sort of we're still in a mental colonization, meaning there was a physical colonization of the land where the Romans came and then the Byzantines and then the Ottomans and between Crusaders and all different forces, and lastly with the British. But what the British particularly did is they convinced the Arabs that the Jews were the enemy, and they convinced the Jews that the Arabs were the enemy. Or you can replace that with convincing the Israelis, convincing the Palestinians. And we're still living in this mindset today where we think the other is our enemy. And it's because that's exactly what colonization does, specifically British colonization, where they go to different countries like in India, and they convince the local populations that they're enemies of each other so that they fight each other rather than fighting the top. And what I noticed, specifically in France, specifically to the extreme left, is that the way anti-Semitism is expressed on the extreme left is by blaming the Jew, or in their representation, that represents the Jewish country Israel, blaming what colonialism actually was, and the guilt that they feel for what their countries did in Africa and Asia and Americas, everywhere around the world, and blaming that on the Jews, using the struggles of the Palestinians, which exist and has to be dealt with, and rather than actually helping people understand each other, end the struggles, unlock each other's liberation movements, use each other to kind of pin one against the other, and are basically fueling this conflict to continue. So that's a little bit about my take on where activism is at. And I'm sensing a shift within the younger generation. I don't know if Mohammed feels it too. I definitely feel it. I've spoken to many other activists on the Palestinian side that we're starting to feel a shift with the ability to connect with one another, to express one another, to understand each other's identities, narratives, aspirations, visions, and building as a generation kind of what we want.